Okay, so just as you all know, that pollinators really play a very important role in the success of your orchards and gardens. And mason bees really are the perfect spring pollinators for orchards because they are incredible super cross pollinators. They're also easy to raise, and as you can see, they're just really fun to watch. Because of that, we've all been welcoming them into our orchards and gardens. But before we can really do that, we first need to know what it is that our mason bees need. And we need to understand their lives and some of their characteristics. And in that way, we're really going to learn how to nourish them by providing them with food and habitat. So today we're going to look at the importance of mason bees and how to care for them. And as we go through our talk, you'll see there's 3 requirements that will be there. So one is going to be food resources. So that's going to be nectar and pollen. Another one is going to be pesticide protection, as well as clay-like soil for staying material. Now, bees are the most abundant pollinators of flowering plants worldwide. Nearly 80% of all flowering plants reproduce due to pollination from bees. A third of the foods that we consume are pollinated by insects. And with our flowering plants, we're talking about pollination, so I should just define it here. But with our flowering plants, pollination occurs at blossom time. And what happens is pollen from the male part of the flower, the stamen, is transferred to the female part, the pistil. Now, if this transfer is successful, it can result in the formation of a seed or fruit, which gives the plant the ability to reproduce. Now, a lot of us are really interested in mason bees, and there's a lot of good reasons to be interested in mason bees. One thing about mason bees is they are a native bee. They also are a solitary bee, and they're very gentle. And pretty true with all of the solitary bees is the fact that they're not very aggressive. They don't have a hive or a nest that they need to patrol and protect. So as far as behavior, they're gentle bees. Makes them ideal for cities and backyards, as they rarely will sting. They also will only fly about 300 feet from their nesting boxes, so they really do stay around. And they're looking at this particular mason bee that you see right here. This is the blue orchard mason bee, Osmia lignaria. And this is, notice the bluish green exoskeleton that it has. That's how it gets its name, the blue orchard mason bee. Now, it is the females that will provision the nest by collecting pollen and nectar. And one of the characteristics of the female mason bee also is that they have a fairly large head. And I just wanted you to see the mandibles. Are you able to see my pointer off of Zoom? But notice how big those mandibles are. The mandibles are really big for carrying these particles of mud that they use as they build their nests.
I'm not seeing your pointer, Mary. This is Deb. I'm not seeing it, but maybe others.
Okay. Well, I probably just, I won't try that trick again then, for I use a pointer. There are 139 species of mason bees that are found in North America. So if you look at this range map right here, they show the 3 most dominant mason bee species. So notice how the yellow dots cover pretty much the whole range of the United States and up into Canada. That is the blue orchard mason bee, the one that we have dominate here in the Pacific Northwest, and that is a native bee, Osmia lignaria. Notice the purple dots really congregate out on the East Coast, and that is the horn-faced mason bee, Osmia cornifrons. It was introduced from Asia, and kind of an interesting side note is that it came over in the 1960s. USDA brought this bee over from Japan with the idea that it would help facilitate pollination of orchards out on the East Coast. But just to bring up, already the blue orchard mason bee was already very well established in that area. So they brought in a non-native with the idea that it would just help facilitate pollination. And if you look at the blue dots, that's Osmia riboflorus, and that is the blueberry mason bee. So that bee is going to start in Oregon, move down through California. You'll see it's throughout the Southwest and into Texas. So that is actually used in blueberry plantations, as well as it's a major pollinator of plants in the family, the Ericaceae family. Now, a lot of us are interested in mason bees because they are a really good pollinator, especially for fruit trees. Some of the things about mason bees is that very active in the early spring, and they also will get out and forage when it's cold as well as wet. They move from blossom to blossom, and this creates a cross-pollination, and it's going to increase the overall genetic diversity of your plants. Now, one of the things that makes the mason bee so good at pollination and cross-pollination is the fact that on their underside of their abdomen, they have these specialized hairs. So all bees have hairs. The fact that that was one of the evolutionary things that happened as they evolved from being a wasp about 130 million years ago to become a bee, is that they started feeding on pollen and developed hairs. So the hairs are a feature for pollen attachment, but these hairs are on the mason bee are these specialized hairs. They're in parallel rows covering the bee's abdomen. And these pollen collecting hairs are called scopa. So just let's imagine now as a mason bee is moving around in an orchard, they will carry this pollen on their abdominal hairs. They do not have pollen baskets like honeybees and bumblebees have. So just imagine now one of the mason bees landing on an apple blossom. So as it lands on the flower, some of the pollen on that blossom will get attached to those abdominal hairs. And the mason bee takes off and it flies a little bit and lands on another flower. And as it lands on this next flower, some of the pollen from the previous flower gets deposited on this next flower. So that is what makes them so effective at pollination and cross-pollination. They say they can visit about more than 1,000 flowers per day, and their pollination rate is extremely high, 95% is what's estimated. So this is a little different than, for example, a honeybee. The mason bee's pollen is held loosely on these hairs, where on a honeybee, the pollen is packed into the pollen baskets. The honeybee moistens it with nectar and packs it. So it's less likely that it will get deposited on next flowers just because of this packing process, that it's not loose on their abdomen like on a mason bee. So let's just look at some of the mason bee homes. So mason bees live in above ground cavities. So that's different than most of our native bees. 70% of our native bees live below the ground in cavities in the ground. Also, mason bees do not excavate their nests. Instead, they're going to seek out existing hollow tubes. So they may find in nature reeds, maybe raspberry canes, or maybe they're by some trees and there are some holes in the trees created by a beetle making a gallery. The beetle is chewed in. The mason bee will go and explore that, and if it's suitable in terms of diameter and length, it may make it into a nest. Now, a lot of us are mason bee enthusiasts, And we have created these backyard nesting boxes to provide nesting sites for the mason bees. Now they are filled with hollow tubes. They could be hollow tubes that are about 6 inches in length and 5/16 of an inch in diameter. The 5/16 of an inch in diameter, the bees are fairly picky about this, in that it's just the right size for that female mason bee to move in and out of the tube, but not so big that they need to go and collect extra mud as they build these partitions in the nest. Also, the tubes should be about 6 inches in length. If the tubes aren't very long, like 4 inches or less, it may make a situation where the mason bee will just make or deposit male eggs rather than female eggs. The boxes are generally hung facing the south or southeast. They should be hung out of the wind. And there's an obvious reason why you do hang them off to the southeast. You want them to get that early morning sun. You want that box to warm up. So we know insects are cold-blooded. Whatever is the environmental temperature is going to be their body temperature. So you just want to get them warm so they can get out and get foraging. Now, I just wanted to tell you something. I'm also a member of the Washington Native Bee Society, and a couple of weeks ago, I heard a talk by one of the members. This is somebody who lives out in like Fall City or Woodinville, one of those towns outside of Seattle. And something he and his dad did on his acreage was he built this giant nesting box. And I'm not exaggerating when I say giant. He calls it the bee-osk, and it's huge. It's like, you know, if you go into the national parks and you go into these, you see these big displays, these kiosks. Imagine something about twice that size. And all through that box area, it is filled with tubes. So some of the tubes could be these paper tubes with a cardboard guards. He has a whole bunch of these wooden blocks in his bee-osk, as well as natural reeds. And something he said was interesting, and he's been doing this for a number of years now, is that out of all of these different things that you can put in between the reeds, the wooden blocks, and the paper tubes, he says that the natural reeds by far are the first to fill. And then he said in the fall, as he harvests the cocoons, he said the biggest cocoons, the ones that are biggest in size and healthiest looking, come out of these natural reeds. So I thought that was a pretty interesting thing. And right now, we talked to Pioneer Elementary School up in the Shelton area, and they're actually going to do a study on this right now. They're trialing different types of nesting material in terms of tubes or blocks or reeds, and then they're going to do a bit of a study similar to what this gentleman did out in either it was Fall City or Woodinville, wherever it was. Now, a lot of us, when we have our boxes, we will put a wire mesh in front just to discourage birds or mammals, keep them away from the cocoons. One thing I do want to say in terms of that is, if you do that, to use something similar to what you see here. So notice the hole size, the opening in the wire is pretty big. You don't want something so fine that as the bee flies in and out, it's going to tear their wings. So once a bee tears their wings, for the most part, they won't survive. So what I'd like us to do right now is to take a look at the annual life cycle of the mason bee. So a mason bee's life cycle is 1 year, and we might as well start with right now, and because emergence is a good time to start, and go through this whole cycle for 1 year and see what they are doing. So the male bees will emerge in the spring when the temperatures generally hit around 57 degrees for several days. The female bees will emerge several days later. Now, in that time, the male bees are buzzing around the nesting blocks, and sometimes the males will actively extract females from the nests in order to mate. Now, after mating, the male bees will die. And I just want you to see the difference here, looking at the male bee and the female mason bee. Notice how much smaller the male bee is. Also, when you look at your bees as they're emerging, hopefully you have an emergence area like an attic on your box or some way that you can watch them as they're chewing their way out of their cocoons. Notice that the male bees will have that shock of white hairs on their head. Their antenna, you can see just the difference here in this picture, is quite a bit longer, all the better for locating these females. And because the male bees are not involved at all in provisioning these nests, they do not have that scopa or those specialized hairs on their lower abdomen for collecting pollen. After mating, the female is going to store the semen, and she's going to use it to fertilize the eggs to create a female offspring. Unfertilized eggs will become male. So after emerging, the females are going to disappear for several days, so you won't see them. And what's going to happen is they need to feed, because they have gone months and months and months and months without eating. So we can say we're famished, and I'm sure they really are famished. So they've depleted their bodies during these months that they have been in this cocoon. So their fat stores are very depleted. Also, she needs to develop her ovaries. So she will go out and feed on pollen. Pollen is a protein, so it's going to help rebuild her body. And then she will feed on nectar, which will give her energy. She's then going to seek out a nesting hole. So once she finds a nesting hole, she'll collect mud, and she'll put the mud in the end of the tube. She'll then go out and collect pollen and nectar. And after she's collected enough, she's determined that, okay, this is enough pollen and nectar. She'll mix it with her saliva, and then she will lay an egg on that pollen and nectar meal. So after laying the egg, she then will go out, collect mud, and seal that off. So she creates a cell inside of that tube. Now, this egg that she lays is really the first of about 25 to 30 eggs that she may lay. On the average, she's going to lay about 1 or 2 eggs a day. This nectar meal that she has provided nectar pollen meal that she's provided will provide protein for the bees for development, as well as energy for them. So if we look at a nest profile, this is pretty much what it looks like. So notice here, this here is one cell, right in, oh, actually you can't see my pointer, I can't really do that, but you'll notice the mud partition, as well as you'll see that pollen and nectar meal, and then notice there'll be a little egg on that pollen and nectar meal, and then another mud partition. So that makes up a cell. And what she's going to do is lay her female eggs to the back of the tube, and then the male eggs get laid to the front. And certainly the males emerge first, so that makes a lot of sense. And she'll repeat this process until she's laid somewhere between 5 to 8 cells, so 5 to 8 eggs per tube. Then she seals off the end with a thicker wall of mud to keep predators out. Now, it takes a lot of energy for her in this nest building just to go out and collect the pollen and nectar, just many, many trips. But it also takes a lot of energy to collect the mud that she needs for building these walls or partitions. So just to give you an idea, an internal wall generally takes about 10 trips for her. So she needs to locate this clay-like mud and then bring it into the nest and build that wall. So one of the thoughts that's really important is to make sure that you have some clay-like mud, you've exposed soil near the nesting box, or you bring in and put in clay-like mud near the nesting box so that she doesn't have to spend as much time searching out mud. And I have some friends who have built mason bee businesses, and they have told me that if you don't have this source of mud nearby, very likely the bee, no matter how beautiful your mason bee box might be, very likely she will just pass you by. So let's take a look at how the larvae develop. So they're in these tubes, the eggs have been laid. After laying the eggs, the female adult bee will die. The eggs, though, will hatch within several days of being laid, and what will happen is that the larvae will begin to feed on this wonderful pollen and nectar meal that their mother has provided for them. So notice here, as you go across, follow across from left to right, you can see that the larvae is getting bigger and bigger, and that pollen and nectar meal is getting smaller and smaller. The larvae will go through a series of molts or instars. So they're going to feed on that pollen and nectar. They reach the boundaries of their exoskeleton, they'll shed that exoskeleton, and the bee will emerge. The bee larvae will emerge with a new exoskeleton and gut. And they do that, I believe it's about 5 times that they do that during this whole process of development. Now, about 3 weeks to a month into this, and this is really temperature dependent, they will have consumed all of the pollen and nectar. And at that point then, they're going to spin a cocoon. So they have these silken glands near their mouth parts, and they will spin this cocoon around themselves and go through pupation. So at this time, once you stop seeing activity from the adult bees, so you're no longer seeing the females bringing in pollen and nectar anymore, all of that is now, there's no more activity from the female adults. And once you see that the tubes are capped off with mud, then you should be able to safely store your bees. And you want to store them outside. You can put them in a garage or a shed, but you really want to keep the temperatures, the summer temperature, whatever is the environmental summer temperature. Hopefully you're keeping it at someplace between 70 and 90 degrees. You generally will put the stored bees tubes, you'll want to put them vertically so that the caps are up, the mud caps are up. Just kind of go back in your mind and picture that little bee larvae on the pollen and nectar meal. They're still feeding at this point, and you want to keep them in position on that pollen and nectar meal so that you don't dislodge them. So you put them with the mud caps up. Now, in this instance, someone built a screen cabinet to protect the little cocoons, the little bees inside. What you don't need to maybe build something like that, although we did at Catalyst, our demonstration garden in Shelton for master gardeners, but certainly putting them in a box and then maybe putting a piece of fabric that you fashion around the top of the box, some way that they can still get air to them, but you want to protect them. And in this instance, you are protecting them from a parasitic wasp. That is going to be the main deterrent to them at this point. So you get them away from these parasitic wasps, and we'll talk more about that role of the parasitic wasp. Now, during the summer months, this is what's happening. So notice on the left, you'll see the larvae inside the cocoon. So that's kind of where we left off in a previous slide. We talked about how the larvae then will spin the silk cocoon around themselves. So during the summer months, the bee will molt again. They go through this molt, but this time the molt is within the cocoon. So they molt out that larval body, and what you're going to see is this white pupa. So that is the center image that you're seeing. So if you look at that, you can start to see the formation of the bee. If you look, you can count the 6 legs. You can see where the eyes are, and notice that really big proboscis sticking off. The bee will molt again then, and it will shed this white pupal skin and then develop the dark coloration of the bee. And that's the final molt as it becomes an adult bee. Now, by early fall, the bee is now transformed into its adult stage. It stays in the cocoon though, so it doesn't emerge. And obviously, it's probably a really good idea that it stays in the cocoon in this state of rest through the winter months, because if it emerged, there's wouldn't be the food resources for them, as well as the fact that it's going to be really cold during the winter months. This is the time in fall when anywhere from really October, November, December, and maybe even January, that you can clean your cocoons. So this is the time that you would open up the tubes and clean your cocoons. And you're welcome to take a snap of this little website, the YouTube website. Sherry Clemens and I made a YouTube video on how to go about cleaning the cocoons, and it has a lot of pretty good information in it. I think it came out to be a really good talk on cleaning cocoons. So during the winter months now, the bees are going to be in this state of rest. You'll want to go ahead and clean them. Once you clean them then, and this is all in this YouTube video, you will then store them in a refrigerator. You keep them in a consistent temperature of about 37 degrees. You want to add some humidity to that. Keep them at least at 50% humidity. Generally, I put a bowl with soaked paper towel in with my nearby the bees just to add some humidity. And then I do monitor the temperature and humidity gauge too. As far as a refrigerator, you would not want to use a frost-free refrigerator. If you do only have a frost-free refrigerator, you can store them in the crisper drawer of your refrigerator. But from what I understand too, is that you don't want to store apples in the refrigerator with them. Apples can off-gas and kill the mason bees. I have a little dorm refrigerator that is not frost-free, and I use it just for storing bees during the winter months. Now, if our temperatures really did finally warm up, if we really do get a spring this year, what you're going to find is the bees will get busy and they will start to chew their way out of these cocoons, and they will start this whole cycle of life over again. So this is a really fun time to watch them as they are chewing their way out of these cocoons and emerging. Now, just to kind of review, we went through this life cycle. So if you look right in the top center, it says emerge in late March. So looking there, that is where we should be right now, but we're having a late spring. Our temperatures just are really not warm enough. We're not seeing a lot of the mason bees emerging yet. It's just been too cold. But moving down the arrow, then you'll find the next step that they will be doing is they will go out and they'll start pollinating, and then provisioning their nests through April and May. And then the larvae will develop. There'll be the formation of cocoons, and then notice way over to the left, this prepupal period where you'll see they go through a pupation inside the cocoon, and then they will overwinter as an adult bee, wings and all, from basically September to March. Now, just because you are a little mason bee doesn't mean that your life is without danger. There's a lot of things that can happen in the day in a life of a mason bee. So why don't we take a look and see what some of these perils are, and let's see if there's things that we can do to help keep the bees safe. So as we go through this, there'll be some perils and surprises that we'll encounter. So first peril is pollen mites. So pollen mites will reproduce inside the mason bee nest. They are considered to be kleptoparasites, and that's because the little mites are going to feed on that pollen and nectar meal that their mother mason bee has left for their young. They will outcompete the little bee larvae as they feed, these pollen mites feed on that pollen and nectar meal, and the little bee larvae will end up starving and dying. And so when you open up your blocks or tubes, you may find parts of the tubes that are just filled with this yellow material. And that can contain pollen mites, or it just could be the frass or droppings, poop from the pollen mites too. So once again, how to take care of this situation? You can decrease the number of mites by washing the cocoons in the fall. So by washing the cocoons, you eliminate these mites, and hopefully you'll see through a number of years that you'll see fewer and fewer of these pollen mites. So just kind of picture what happens to the bee. So for example, in the center image, you'll see all those pollen mites there. So imagine now an adult mason bee emerging from the nest, and as they emerge, they have to get through these areas that have the pollen and nectar mites. So some of those mites then get attached to the bee, the new bee's body, and they'll hitch a ride on that adult bee. And as they go into a new nesting area, that bee can bring those pollen mites with them. So wash your cocoons, get rid of these pollen mites, and do that October through anytime October through December to give them a good washing. Also, we have a peril in the Houdini fly. Now, the Houdini fly is a non-native fly, and it is also a kleptoparasite. This is a really small fly. It's actually a Drosophila, or a fruit fly. So it's in that range of flies, the Drosophila, that genus. And one of the things about it is that the adult fly will kind of watch what's going on with the mason bees. As the mother mason bee is provisioning the nests, this fruit fly, the Houdini fly, will see when she exits, the Houdini fly will zip into the nest, will deposit her eggs, and then leave the nest. The mason bee comes in and continues to provision, builds her mud wall and things like that, but she's unaware that eggs have been laid. So over the course of the next months, or maybe not even next month, over the course of a number of weeks probably, those maggots will develop. So the fly eggs hatch, the maggots emerge, and they also then will outcompete the little bee larvae for the pollen and nectar meal. So they will feed on it, and the little bee larvae will end up starving and dying. Now, this is a real unpleasant thing when you open up these tubes and you see these maggots. So this winter, we ended up cleaning a lot of cocoons. A lot of the master gardeners said, oh, let's all do them together. So folks came out to our cabin and we cleaned just thousands of cocoons through the winter months. And we did see Houdini flies, and we were really, the larvae, excuse me, the maggots, we were really careful with how we treated them. So we had set newspapers out and as part of our cleaning, and we just very carefully rolled them up, made sure that we got them all, and we had a wood burning stove, and we just burned them all in the fire. But this is definitely not something that you want to escape and get out into your own yard. You don't want to really be dealing with these Houdini flies. And as I said, this is a non-native, and it really hasn't been in the United States all that long. Another peril is chalk brood, and this is a fungal infection that will kill the bee larvae. So in this instance, fungal spores are transferred to the eggs while they're building the nest. And then the little larvae, the bee larvae, will start to feed on these spore-infested pollen and nectar meal, and it will kill their gut. So the larvae will die, but the fungus will continue to grow and produce more spores. So if you see cocoons that are very crisp and look like this C shape here, that is most likely the chalk brood is what you're seeing. So once again, you'll want to make sure that you clean your cocoons, that you open them up in the fall. And if you have something like this, you'll want to make sure that you also are really careful with this. You want to, if you're using the wooden nesting blocks and you're reusing those, you'll want to clean those really well, and then clean your cocoons really well so you don't transmit this fungal infection. Now, I mentioned parasitic wasps a little bit ago as one of the perils, and I said that's why in early summer, once all of the activity is over with the adult bees and they're no longer provisioning nests, then you want to think about storing the cocoons or the larvae if they're still in that state. So what you are trying to do is separate them from this parasitic wasp. So this parasitic wasp, the one that affects the mason bee cocoons, is called Monodonta maris. And notice the big ovipositor that it has. I will say this is a fairly small wasp. One of my friends and I were working with some of the cocoons, and we actually saw it emerge out of the cocoons. And I was surprised how small it was. It's kind of almost seemed, as far as comparing it to another insect, it was probably a little smaller than a mosquito. So the parasitic wasp will oviposit or lay its eggs into the bee's cocoon. Those parasitic wasp eggs will go ahead and they will hatch, and out will crawl the little parasitic wasp larvae. The wasp larvae will then feed on the mason bee and consume it. So if you see tubes that have these holes in them, or if you see cocoons that have these holes in them, you know that the cocoon has been affected by a parasitic wasp. And the hole is not the hole that the ovipositor caused as they deposited the eggs. That would be something that you wouldn't even be able to detect. The hole that you're seeing there in that tube is really the emergence hole. So the parasitic wasp will go through its whole life cycle. It goes through molts, it goes through pupation, and then emerges as an adult parasitic wasp. So that is what you're seeing, is the emergence hole from where the parasitic wasp came out of the cocoon. Now, you So we said you can decrease the risk of these parasitic wasps simply by getting these tubes put away into some sort of a screen cabinet or some protected area, just to get them away from being outside where these parasitic wasps will be looking for them so that they can deposit their eggs in the cocoon. Now, another peril is insecticides, especially a class of insecticides called the neonicotinoids. And you may be familiar with this class of insecticide. It's been used widely, and one of the biggest problem with this insecticide is that it's systemically absorbed by the plant. So that means it's everywhere in the plant. So it's also in the pollen and nectar, and that will then make the pollen and nectar toxic to the bees as they come in to pollinate and feed. Now you may think to yourself, okay, I can remember this, and I'm simply never going to buy one of these neonicotinoids. This isn't that hard. But the thing about it is, and you think about the word neo means new, nicotinoids derived from nicotine. Nicotine was used as early as the 1690s as an insecticide. But the thing that's really hard about this is that if you go to the store and you just look at these insecticides, they're not labeled as neonicotinoids. Instead, neonicotinoid is a class of insecticide that contains 7 different insecticides. And they all have pretty hard to remember chemical names. So ideally, if you are trying to draw in bees for pollination, using an insecticide really goes against that grain. So ideally, just avoid all insecticides when you're trying to bring in pollinators, especially anything that is in bloom. Another problem as far as apparel is climatic mismatches as we start to experience climate change. So we have seen that there are these shifts now that are occurring in temperature and rainfall and snowpack, and that can really affect bee distribution. It can force them into more unfavorable habitats. But we're also starting to experience these mismatches. So in these mismatches, you're going to find that maybe the bees are going to emerge at a non-optimal time with the flowering plants. And that actually happened last year. We had a mismatch. So what happened last year was our bees emerged in March. And then the second week in April, we had a snowstorm, and it killed a lot of the blossoms. And that resulted in a real loss of food resources for the bees. One of my friends has a business with mason bees, and she, on the average, ends up with about 43,000 cocoons every year. And last year, because of this mismatch, she ended up with only 11,000 cocoons. So these can have a really big impact on our bees in terms of their ability to sustain themselves during these periods where there's not food resources for them. And certainly as we're going through this period right now, where we're getting into not yet the middle of April, but we're getting into April, I'm certainly hoping that our weather starts to warm so that the mason bees can really start to emerge. Because from what I'm in Olympia and what I'm seeing is that a lot of the different plants around, a lot of the flowering fruit trees are really coming on right now, and it would be nice to see mason bees emerging to take advantage of that. So something you might want to consider is, besides fruit trees, to use this wide variety of plants that are going to bloom from early spring into summer. So have some backups with that thought too. So some ideas as far as this concept of successional blooms is to think about maybe in the winter having heather. That winter heather is certainly a favorite of the bees. And as far as pollen, willow pollen is just a huge resource for bees. It's textbook. Every textbook that you read about bees will talk about willow pollen. So important. Another plant that has done really well is the Pyrrhus japonica. The first bee that I saw this year, several weeks ago, a bumblebee was on a Pyrrhus japonica. Oregon grape is a native plant that is in bloom right now. It's also a great resource. And then something not to forget is trees too. And certainly with fruit trees, I know you don't forget, but remember trees like big leaf maples too. Big leaf maples, think about how many blossoms you can see on a branch on a tree like big leaf maple. So a branch can stretch out some distance and it can be covered in maple flowers. And think about how many branches are on one of these really big leaf maple trees, these really big ones. So they can provide an incredible resource, and they are a big resource for the mason bee as well as bumblebees. Now, one of the surprises that we had as we've been working with mason bees, and in particular at our Catalyst demonstration garden in Mason County, was yellow jackets. So we went to load new nesting tubes into some boxes, and these nesting boxes were kind of up high, and we had to get a ladder out and climb up to put these new tubes in. And as we did it, I was the one up on the ladder, and I was looking back into the box and just kind of assessing how clean is the box and different things like that. And I looked up at the top of the box, and it was 100% covered in yellow jackets. And they are all facing me, just looking out at me. So these boxes can make great overwintering opportunities for the yellow jackets, as those yellow jacket queens will go into that state of rest to survive the winter months. In this year too, I have to say, with all of the cocoons that I opened up through the winter time, all of the tubes that I opened up as we cleaned the cocoons, in the tubes we had a dozen, over a number of different tubes, we had a dozen yellow jackets that had crawled into the tubes, these queens, to use as overwintering opportunities. So now I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of yellow jacket nests in my yard next year, so we just let all those little queens outside.
Wow.
Another surprise was the Japanese hornface bee. I don't know if you think back to that range map that I showed, and I showed how there were these purple little dots, and they correlated to the Japanese hornface bee that you saw out on the East Coast. Well, we also have them in our area. A couple years ago, I went down to help clean cocoons with a friend in Woodinville. And that morning we cleaned about 5,000 cocoons. And out of those 5,000, 2,000 of them were this Japanese horn-faced bee. And even in Mason County this winter when we cleaned cocoons, one of my friends lives in, not far from Oakland Bay. And as we opened her cocoons, we also saw the Japanese horn-faced cocoons. So the Japanese horn-faced bee does have these, if you look closely at the face, you'll see these little horns coming off kind of below their eyes. So that's how they get their name. They do have a similar life cycle, and as well as pollination efficiency like our blue orchard mason bee. But notice the difference in the cocoons. So on the bottom row, you see those two cocoons. Those are the cocoons of the blue orchard mason bee. But notice the row of cocoons above. Those are the cocoons from the Japanese hornface bee. And there's a little saying, they say that they look like a string of pearls, and they really do have that look about them. Another surprise was earwigs. We had a number of earwigs in the tubes, not as many as I thought maybe we could see. One of my friends works for WSDA in entomology, and in talking to him, he said earwigs really got into his tubes this year and really made a mess. So they'll go in and feed on nectar as well as other insects. And then we saw pseudoscorpion. So pseudoscorpions are a little microarthropod. They're not a real scorpion. They don't have that stinger, but they're going to feed on pollen mites as well as things like bark lice and maybe some of the little domestic beetles that you might find inside these nest areas as you're cleaning.
So Mary, sorry. So the pseudoscorpions are good.
The pseudoscorpions are a predator, and they could be eating these pollen mites. They're not doing any damage to the cocoons or anything like that. They're in there because there's other things in there that they are feeding on. And usually where you find these pseudoscorpions, often they're in like mats of moss. Like if you are out in the forest and you find these mats of moss, they're very likely more in these kind of moist places like that. So just in summary, the blue orchard mason bee is really an important native pollinator. Is extremely efficient at transferring pollen with the pollen kept loose on those abdominal hairs. The mason bees, as far as the adult part of their life cycle, they are short-lived, but they really have a big impact on our early season pollination. Caring for the bees is really a grassroots effort for all of our gardeners and fruit tree growers and the bee enthusiasts who love these mason bees. So it's so much more than just putting out the bees and watching them and then letting them take care of themselves. So cleaning the cocoons and caring for the nesting site is really going to help ensure their survival and success. So with that, if there's any questions that you might have.
Oh, fascinating. Well, I had no idea about many of these aspects of the mason bees. One person had asked a question. So should we value or destroy the Japanese bees, the Asian bees?
Oh, no, we definitely, they're here, the Japanese hornface bee, and they are valued. This friend of mine who has a mason bee business, a lot of these bees are similar to how our honeybees are in these hives and they're being trucked, into the orchards and the hives are set out. There's a degree of that happening with the mason bees too. So for example, with this friend of mine who had all of those hornface bees that year, she, as they were being distributed, as she was selling them, they went down to Los Angeles to pollinate the almond orchards. So these bees are getting moved around, almost similar to our honeybee.
Mary, do you wash the cocoons?
Yes, I definitely wash the cocoons. It's
and
really
do you use a Clorox solution?
Yes. So what we do is we get a container and we maybe, let's say like a gallon of water, or several gallons, and you use 1 tablespoon per gallon and mix it the bees then are put in there, and it's going to kill any of the pollen mites or any of that chalk brood that is on them. Then you just swish them around. There's fairly a lot of that little mud from building those partitions flakes off. You then use a strainer, you take the bees out, and then you rinse them. We rinse them several times in just nice, cold, fresh water, just to clean them and make sure the Clorox is removed. Then we go ahead and set them out on newspapers and let them dry. And then we store them in the refrigerators, as I mentioned, at 37 degrees with 50% humidity. And storing them in the refrigerator for the winter months helps with them maintaining those fat deposits. So it helps keep them at this consistent temperature, so they're not like experiencing a warm period in the winter and burning through more of those fats. It's going to help keep them healthier by keeping them in a consistent temperature through the winter months in refrigeration. How many of you wash your cocoons and take care of the bees in that way?
I didn't know we needed to do that.
It's really important to spread the word to do it. And there's certainly, I hope that you can maybe click on the link or share that link that Sherry Clemens and I made about how to go about cleaning the cocoons, because it really does improve their lives in terms of getting some of these pests away from them. For example, the pollen mites are opening up these tubes and seeing these Houdini fly maggots. It's not a pretty sight. And thinking, that all of these maggots just on a little bee larvae feeding on it. It's important to get rid of some of these things that have a big impact, a negative impact on the bees.
Wow. From Tilbury, says a friend in Chehalis area found flower beetles in her nests for the first time. Flower beetles.
I think there's a number of little beetles that do get into these nests too. The ones that I went through are ones that are fairly common, but I'm pretty sure things like flower beetles also can get into these nests too.
Thank you, Mark, for putting that
Sure.
link.
I have a couple of questions, Mary. I've just put up a mason bee house with some cocoons in it for the first time. And it's under the eaves, it's facing east, but no sun hits it. So for now, that seems okay because the temperatures are really too cold for the bees. But when it comes time, do I need to make sure the morning sun hits it?
Well, if you think about the bees, they are cold-blooded. So whatever the environmental temperature is going to be their temperature. So if they're staying cold in the morning, then they're going to be less likely to get out and forage. So they can't get out and forage until their body gets warm enough that they can get their flight muscles going and they can get out. So generally getting the nesting box facing the southeast is really ideal. So I like to keep mine under the eaves too, to keep rain off of the box, especially if you're using paper tubes. It just seems to be a really, nice idea to provide that level of protection. Is there any way that you can move it to a southeast side and get a little more sun?
I'll have to think about it, but I wanted to protect it from hot sun when it came. So
Yeah.
Because I think that's also important.
And that is important, to try to find a spot also to avoid that hot afternoon sun. But hopefully by the time the hot sun comes, that you will have the bees taken and put into storage.
Got it.
So,
Got it.
um,
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
yeah.
The other question I have is about the clay. There isn't a
Mhm.
lot of clay around here. And so basically what I think I need is essentially dirt, not humus, not something that will pack together and harden with water, basically. Is that
Right.
correct?
You don't, it's kind of like, they truly are masons. So a mason wouldn't want to work with sandy material because it's just going to crack. It could crack and fall apart. So clay is ideal. But if you don't have clay, using a good soil, if you can take it, hold it in your hand, and then have a fist and compress it, and if it can hold its shape after you open your hand, it should probably be pretty good.
Huh.
We have a lot of hard pan where we are, so we
Yeah.
only have to dig about 2 feet and it's all clay.
Huh.
Maybe not even 2 feet in some places. We also have a beach out by Oakland Bay, and there's a whole wall that is hard pan, so we can just go chip away at that and bring some of that back.
Okay.
Any other questions, Mark?
Well, Scott just posted that he's heard that kitty litter can be a substitute for clay. Is that
I
something?
have read that too, that you can do that. I can't remember what the source was on that,
Mhm.
but I have read that too.
It's worth testing, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I would do, is test it.
Yeah.
I wonder maybe adding some moisture to the kitty litter so that it's not quite as hard. I don't know.
They also say too, if you can, to keep your soil moist, it is something that they like too.
Question. Keep talking about natural reed materials. So I'm just kind of confused. Do we have any of that material around here, or should we just use paper tubes?
Well, you can use hollowed stems. You can also use, so you mentioned raspberry canes are mentioned as something that's really a good source. You can order these, I think they're called phragmites, something like that. The reeds that I mentioned, you can order them from Crown Bee, so you can do that. Also, we're just kind of doing some experimenting at our cattle's garden this year. We're looking as the plants, as far as cutting back plants, lupin, dahlias, let's see here. There's a number of plants that do have hollowed out stems, hollyhocks. So you can kind of look for things like that too, and see if you have any still from last year, if you can clip some of those and use them.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question.
Mhm.
How do you open up the hollow tube then? Because I know, because in the past I've used the wooden trays, which you can just scrape out.
Right.
But we know Crown Bees had a hard time last fall opening up their plant tubes.
Okay, so think about these tubes. So they usually keep them in a cardboard guard, and then there's the tube here. One of the things that I like to do, and let me just show you, I'll do this right here. Is I like to use one of these letter openers.
Mary,
These tubes.
I'm sorry, this is Deb. Could I make a suggestion? If you stop sharing your screen, we
Oh,
might
sure.
be able to make
Thank
your
you.
picture.
No, that's
larger.
really, thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
So one of the things that I like to do is before we put the tubes out, we'll take a letter opener and just go ahead and cut through the tube. So you cut through the tube. The tube is really rigid, and it's going to just pop shut anyway. And then you can go ahead and put it back in the guard tube. And then when you're cleaning the tubes, all you have to do is pull it out. It's already been cut, and all you have to do then is just go ahead and open up the tube. Something else that you can do, remember that I mentioned that 70% of our native bees live in the soil. So think about that. In the soil, there's always water percolating through. So the bees, even to give you an idea, bumblebees, the queen bumblebees generally will go through that state of rest or hibernation through the winter months in soil. So they just go a couple inches down into the soil and they overwinter there. So they are experiencing water running all the time. And so and you're also going to be cleaning the cocoons. So a lot of times what we do too is take the tube and we just have a container. This is, for example, one that hasn't been cut. Just stick it in water. These tubes are spiraled. They have glue in them, and then you can just quickly open them up. So that's an easy way to do the tubes. So just maybe 5-10 minutes in a little Tupperware with some water, and then they're super easy to open.
Wow. Wow.
It's-
Such an excellent presentation. Sorry, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was going to say it's a fun social thing, getting together and cleaning cocoons with your friends. It's kind of like I don't know what it would be like, but there's a lot of fun conversation. There's always surprises like, oh my gosh, look at this. And it's a fun thing to do.
I wonder if that could be an activity, maybe like for the club to do. Bring your mason bees and we'll help you clean them and be a social event.
Well, I
it's
know
fun.
that some of the places, yeah, in oh, that's funny that you said the quilting bee. That's really funny. It's there is a Mason, not a Mason County, I think it's Collins County does that, where they open up for people coming, the master gardeners, cleaning their bees, helping them clean.
A few years ago, Peninsula Fruit Club did that for one of our fall meetings. And some people had some microscopes that you could bring in and you could see the predatory creatures are inside the nest, and you could actually see the little pollen mites crawling around underneath the microscope. It was really interesting meeting.
That would be very interesting, having one of the dissecting scopes so you
Right,
can
yeah.
see that level of detail. That would be very fun.
Mhm. Very interesting. Other questions? Gosh, Mary, this is really well done, and thank you so very much for your presentation. Yay.
Very much. And thank you all for your interest in bees and helping in their conservation. Thank you very much.
We will do our best.
It was
Wow.
awesome, Mary. Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah.
thanks, Mark. And thanks for all your good work on Bainbridge. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I hope you all have a good evening, and let's hope our Mason bees get a little warmer weather and can get out and about. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Mary. Take care.
Take good care.
Well, thanks everyone for being here. Any other? Wow, that was really well done and lots of information. I want to watch that cloud recording again soon, which I will end the recording. Stop the recording. Okay, here we go. Yes.